War, Albert Cashier, a small and elderly Civil War veteran of the 95th Illinois Infantry, was clearing debris from the driveway as the state senator, Ira Lish, who was accidentally bent over and was accidentally struck by the state senator's car. The town doctor was summoned, and in the process of setting the broken femur, it was discovered that Albert Cashier was not a he, but rather a she. Cashier had lived since the Civil War as a man, had voted in elections, and had received the veteran's pension. When the secret leaked out to the press, Cashier's comrades in arms rallied around her, affirming the story of her service and calling for her to be cared for as befit a Civil War veteran. Were it not for this automobile accident, we would not know the extraordinary truth about this soldier, that she was a woman serving among the ranks of men.
In order to understand why women would want to disguise themselves as men and to join the army, and how they were able to do this, it's important to understand Victorian society. Socially, men and women were separated into two spheres. Men were supposed to care for their family, and women were supposed to stay at home and raise children and care for the home. In this society, it was literally inconceivable that women would want to dress as men or take on jobs that men normally would. As we will see, there are many incentives for women to join the army. One of the reasons to impersonate a man was the freedom that would bring. In Victorian society, women could not own property, they could not vote. They were expected to marry, and they had limited employment opportunities if they did not marry. Indeed, we can actually list those opportunities: laundress, cook, seamstress, teacher, governess, maid, and, of course, in extreme cases, prostitution. By joining the army, women could escape from arranged or abusive marriages, they could own property, they could vote in elections, and they could earn a decent wage. A well-paid maid in New York City at the time was only earning $4 a month, where, in contrast, a union private could earn $13 a month. There were some women who joined the army simply in order to follow a loved one or a relative into battle. We also cannot discount the fact that women also served their country for the same reason as men. They were patriotic, and they wanted to do their duty.
While it was illegal for women to dress as men, and for them to enlist in either army, north or south, hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 women, nevertheless disguised themselves as men and enlisted. In the decades after the war, the general number of women soldiers in the Union Army alone was estimated to be slightly less than 400, a number that Mary Livermore of the United States Sanitary Commission thought was too low. In her words, quote, "I am convinced a larger number of women disguised themselves and enlisted in the service for one cause or another than was dreamed of," unquote. Deanne Blanton and Lauren Cook, in their book, They Fought Like Demons, Women Soldiers of the Civil War, document about 250 individual women soldiers. Richard Hall, in his publication, Women on the Civil War Battlefront, was convinced, based on his archival research, that at least 1,000, possibly over 1,000, women served as soldiers in the American Civil War. Today we will discuss some of the best documented of these women soldiers. 4 women soldiers left written accounts regarding their military service. And they were either in the form of published memoirs or in the form of letters written home to their families that were preserved to us today. Most other women soldiers that are known to us were only discovered, like Albert Cashier, when accident, sickness, wounding, or capture, or even death, made others aware of their true gender. These astonishing discoveries were entered into official military documents and communications, and into the letters, diaries, and memoirs of generals, surgeons, nurses, other officers, and enlisted soldiers, and as well were published in newspaper accounts of the day.
Sort of a side note here, we're mentioning some publications that in the course of our talk we're citing references, and I've paired recommended reading list here that has
You
the.
want to go ahead and pass?
I can pass this out if you want to take a copy, feel free, and then you can follow up on your own and maybe read some more on this. Okay, so you're probably wondering, hey, these women obviously had incentive to join the Army. Well, how did they do that? How did they pass the initial physical? How did they get by the recruiter? Basically, Army physicals in the 19th century could often be very cursory. When the person walked into the recruiting office, the recruiter was looking for a person with 2 good arms, 2 good legs, a good trigger finger, and if you're joining the infantry, 2 opposing teeth. You need 2 opposing teeth in order to bite the cartridge to load your rifle. And if you satisfied all of those requirements, you were not required to take your clothes off or anything else, and you would pass the exam. Indeed, one of our women soldiers that we'll discuss, the recruiting officer actually only looked at her hands to make sure her hands were clean. In addition, there were many young boys that were enlisting in the Army at the time who were not yet shaving, who still had high voices, so a woman could pass herself off as a young lad. Then there's the whole idea of Victorian modesty and Victorian privacy. When these women joined the Army and were out in a camp situation, the soldiers usually did not take off their uniforms to sleep, especially when they were on the march. Bathing was not very often, and if it was done at all, it was done in a private way. There were common latrines that were dug in camp, but many of the soldiers preferred not to use them because they were not very pleasant to use or because they preferred being a private person. So a soldier being seen going off into the woods and doing their business, it would not arouse any suspicion whatsoever. There was a whole idea in Victorian society of clothes make a man. Literally, the mindset was such that if a person was wearing pants, that person was automatically assumed to be male. No questions asked. The person was not looking for little clues or secrets. It was just pretty obvious in that time. Person wearing pants, the person's a man. Then, of course, the whole idea of the whole uniforms. As you can see, we're wearing two types of Union uniforms. Usually we do this, one of us is a Confederate and one of us is a Federal. But we've got an event at Fort Frederick this afternoon, so we're both in Union today. So apologies to the Confederate people. Anyway, the clothing could be ill-fitting. A soldier was issued a uniform. It could be very big. Soldier walking around in baggy uniform hides a lot. They're not to be seen to be unusual. In the beginning of the war, a lot of times they were issued a frock coat. The frock coat can help to hide hips in a female. Collars were expected to be buttoned with the top button at all times was buttoned. That helps to hide the Adam's apple, or the lack of Adam's apple, I should say.
They were looking for that.
Well, and that's the other thing. Again, the mindset was
Why would a woman dress like a man? That's ridiculous.
Right. The clues, I mean, they weren't looking for any kind of clues, but again, the clothing did help to hide that.
And I'm wearing a Federal issue sack coat. It's called sack coat because it's pretty much like a sack. But it also helps to hide female characteristics, and you can also bind your chest.
And cut your hair short,
Cut your hair short.
wear your hat, and you're good to go.
And you're in an army with a lot of young men, and you don't really stand out. So there's a lot of young men out there that aren't shaving yet, so.
The mindset of the soldiers was, as I said, the mindset was everything. And that was the most important in aiding these women. The mindset is very well illustrated by a quote from Colonel Orlando Poe concerning a soldier that after the war was discovered to be a female that he served quite closely with. He says, "A single glance at her in her proper character
Now, she would enlist with the 2nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry. She herself was born and raised in New Brunswick, Canada. She ran away from home at age 17 because her father had arranged arranged marriage for her to a neighboring farmer, an older gentleman, and she wanted no part of it. And her father was evidently a very persistent fellow, and she felt that he would come and track her down. So in order to throw him off the trail, she decided the only way to do this was to just change her sex. So she cut her hair, put on trousers and a shirt, and she would gain employment as a traveling book salesman, a Bible salesman. And she did quite well at this. She operated in Michigan, in New England, and in Canada. And very successful, made about $900 a year, which was a great wage in 1860. However, in 1861, she was living in Flint, Michigan. And in 1861, after Fort Sumter was fired upon by the Confederates, she felt that it was her duty, like so many of the young men in her adopted home, to take up arms to defend the Union. So, well, she had already established her identity as Franklin Thompson, the bookseller, so it was a matter of becoming Franklin Thompson, the private. And she would walk into an enlistment station in Flint, Michigan, showed the surgeon her hands. The surgeon asked her what her hands did. She told him she was a bookseller, and said, fair enough, she had the other qualifications that one needed for the infantry. There was no physical exam required other than looking at her hands. She signed up and enlisted and was in the 2nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry. So she would be sent to Washington, D.C. with her regiment. She was detailed as a nurse from June of 1861 until the spring of 1862. She would be a nurse at the Battle of First Manassas, or Bull Run, in July of 1861. And she remained so long caring for the wounded in a temporary hospital that she was almost captured as the Union forces retreated back to Washington. Her male guides helped her as a nurse. At the beginning of the Civil War, women were not readily accepted as nurses. They could be nurses at home, but to nurse strangers, especially strange men, was unseemly for a lady of any social standing. Women would gain acceptance as nurses as the war continued, and their labor, their successful caring of the wounded, and the lack of manpower to take care of the wounded made that effort necessary. And the Army realized that this is a great resource and we can count on these women to do a terrific job. But at the beginning of the war, nursing was a man's job. It would actually be, for soldiers, it would be soldiers that would be pulled out of the ranks and would be detailed as nurses, which is what happened to her. So Edmonds, by virtue of her male disguise, could, as she wrote, quote, best serve the Union cause in male attire, better perform the duties necessary for the sick and wounded men, and with less embarrassment to them and to myself as a man rather than a woman, unquote. In March of 1862, she would be detailed as a regimental mail carrier, and as such, was seen and eagerly awaited by every man in the regiment. She served as a mail carrier during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, 7 battles. The time of the Battle of 2nd Manassas, she was actually trying to jump a ditch, riding a mule in her mail carrying duties, and the mule tripped and fell on her. She broke her ribs and really badly damaged her leg. But she didn't want to be seen by a surgeon because as soon as she was seen by a surgeon, her disguise would be revealed and she would be forced to leave the Army because she was a woman, and that was completely against Army regulations for you to be a woman in the Army. And also, people would ask, well, what is this woman doing in the Army? I mean, what kind of woman would be around men in an Army? And that would just, cause, her whole social standing. It's like, what kind of woman would be among men? Well, somebody who's trying to, who's a loose woman and not, a upstanding Christian dedicated, faithful woman, as she herself was. So she didn't want to be discovered, so she didn't see the surgeon. And this fall would debilitate her later in life. In Nurse and Spy, she also describes she's a spy for the Union. She crosses Confederate lines in a variety of different guises, including as a slave, an Irish peddler woman, and a young man wanting to enlist in the Confederate cavalry. She would apply for a pension, and she would decline to include her espionage activities because she called them mean deception. She was not proud to have been, she wants to be known as a nurse and as a soldier, but not a spy. According to Nurse and Spy, Edmonds was at Antietam, where she writes of comforting and burying another woman soldier. Because the 2nd Michigan was in Washington, D.C. at the time of the Battle of Antietam, and Edmonds does not list Antietam on her pension request, I'm questioning whether this detail of the story was an actual event. I think it was rather a literary device for her to explain to the reader her own personal reasons for enlisting. Now, in the words of the dying soldier, the dying soldier tells Edmonds, and I think these are her own words, "I can trust you and will tell you a secret. I am not what I seem, but I am female. I have enlisted for purest motives, and I have remained undiscovered. I have performed the duties of a soldier faithfully, and I am willing to die for the cause of truth and freedom." Edmonds, however, most certainly was at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. She served as an orderly for her colonel, Colonel Poe, whose quote we read at the beginning, that no one ever thought of seeing a woman in soldier's dress. That was her. She was his orderly at the Battle of Fredericksburg. She's relaying commands between officers while under fire. She was greatly saddened after the loss of Fredericksburg. In March of 1863, she was sent with the regiment to Lebanon, Kentucky, where she fell ill with malarial fever. Still sick in April, and what she wanted to do, she applied for a furlough so that she could go change into women's clothing, seek private medical care, change back into her soldier's clothes, and return back to the regiment without anybody knowing that she was a woman. But her furlough was denied, so she felt that the only thing left for her to do was to desert, because had been discovered to be a woman in a military hospital was just, something that she did not want to have happen to her. And as in her own words, she says, "I would have rather been shot dead than to have been known to be a woman and sent away from the army under guard as a criminal." So she deserted. However, she was greatly disabled by this fall that had happened to her, to the point where she was bedridden later in life. She applied for a pension. She saw all these other soldiers were getting pensions, and she said, "Well, I deserve one too. I served my country. I can't take care of myself now because of my wounds, my injuries that I had received in the service of the United States. So I'm going to apply for a pension." However, in order to get a pension, she had to have that charge of desertion for Franklin Thompson removed. She had to prove that she was one and the same person as Franklin Thompson. And then, only then, after that desertion had been removed, could she apply for a pension. And in order to do this, she had to have all the comrades that she served with verify that she was one and the same person as Franklin Thompson, and to have explained, because I deserved it, because I would have been discovered otherwise, so that she could have that desertion removed. She successfully, she seeks her comrades in arms, her former comrades in arms, and they look at her and they say, "Do you have a sister? I mean, it's like, are you a sister? Do you have a brother? Franklin Thompson? You're just a spitting image of Franklin Thompson." And she reveals to them the truth that, well, I am actually Franklin Thompson. And they write to Congress. Her desertion, the charge of desertion is removed from her record, and she is the only woman to receive the only known woman soldier to receive a pension in the military at this time. A second woman soldier adventures and travels of Madame Loretta Jeanette Velasquez, otherwise known as Lieutenant Harry T. Buford, Confederate States Army, which I will refer to as Women in Battle from here on out, just so that we're not here until tomorrow night. According to the Women in Battle, Velasquez was a Cuban-born woman who spent her childhood in Texas and in New Orleans. She married a U.S. Army officer by the name of William, who was from Texas, who would resign his commission in 1861 to serve the South. Velasquez wished to follow her husband to war for the adventure. She disguised herself as a young lieutenant and raised an infantry company in Arkansas to present to her husband and follow him to war. According to her account, her husband was killed in an accident while the unit was in training, but Velasquez continued on after his death for the adventure of battle and to prove herself a capable soldier. She describes being at the Battle of First Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861, the Battle of Leesburg or Ball's Bluff in October of 1861, the Battle of Fort Donelson in February of 1862, and at Shiloh, fought in April of 1862, where she was wounded and her sex was discovered. Velasquez also describes being a spy operating in Washington and New Orleans, a smuggler, a distributor of counterfeit Confederate currency, and a double agent working for the Confederacy while employed by the Union under actually General Lafayette Baker. Now there's controversy over Women in Battle. The adventures that Velasquez presented at the time of publication were controversial in her day and continue to be controversial into our day. Confederate General Jubal Early deemed Women in Battle a libelous work that insulted the Confederacy and Southern womanhood and presented impossible adventures. He was especially shocked at her description of Southern men having coarse manners and Southern women being eager to throw themselves into the arms of men and women in uniform. This behavior went completely against the image of Southern chivalry that Early was seeking to promote, and he denounced Velasquez as a fraud. Former Confederate General James Longstreet, however, in an 1888 letter, recalled meeting Velasquez after the war, and he recalled meeting a woman in the ranks who was called Buford, and thought that her adventures were remarkable. And even today, we have scholars that would just completely discount her as a fraud, and her writings as fraudulent and made up. However, while her story certainly is greatly fictionalized and a highly entertaining read, numerous events in Velasquez are corroborated by numerous independent sources that were made during the period of the Civil War that are found in official documents, in newspaper reports, and diary entries. And they mention Velasquez under a number of different aliases in the guise of a soldier or spy, as she herself describes in Women in Battle. For example, on October 9, 1861, the Louisville Daily Journal reported the arrest of Miss Mary Ann Keith in Lynchburg, Virginia, who had registered at a local hotel under the name of Lieutenant Buford, quote, rigged out in a full suit of soldier's clothes, unquote. She gave her reasons for dressing in soldier's clothes, as she was determined to fight the battles of her country and thought such a disguise more likely to enable her to accomplish her objective. In an entry made in November of 1861, John Jones, as published in his writings, a rebel war clerk's diary, reported meeting a diminutive lieutenant who applied for a passport and transport without a commander's authorization. Jones wrote that he became especially suspicious of the lieutenant when she curtsied upon leaving his presence, rather than giving a military salute. Jones reported the incident to the provost marshal, and the lieutenant was arrested and indeed found to be a woman. Velasquez reports her arrest and her run-in with the clerk in Women in Battle. On April 30th, 1862, the Daily Chronicle and Sentinel in Augusta, Georgia, reported a wounded female Confederate soldier by the name of Arnold. Now, Arnold is one of her she marries a couple times, and Arnold is one of her married names, so you will see her, one of her aliases repeatedly as either as Arnold, well, Arnold and Williams being her most quoted aliases. But here's this soldier by the name of Arnold. In Woman in Battle, Velasquez describes being imprisoned in Castle Thunder because she is a woman impersonating a soldier. They would arrest and imprison you for that. Her imprisonment is mentioned in several newspapers and diary accounts during the summer of 1863. For example, the Richmond Whig at this time describes a Miss Laura J. Williams, using that Williams, her first husband's name, of Arkansas, who, quote, demonstrated little characteristics of her sex in either mind or body, unquote, who wanted to also offer herself on the altar of her country, unquote. Williams was one of her married names, as I just explained here. According to the Whig, Mrs. Williams was disguised as a Confederate soldier with the name Henry Bedford, had raised an independent company in Texas, went to Virginia as his first lieutenant, was in the Battle of Leesburg, returned home briefly to Arkansas because her sex was discovered, took up her soldier identity again in Corinth, and was in the Battle of Shiloh, where she displayed great coolness and courage, then visited New Orleans, where she was a smuggler, who was arrested and brought before Union General Benjamin Butler, who denounced her as the most incorrigible rebel he ever met. Just means that she would not back down, just the most rebellious rebel he had ever met. She was just the quintessential rebel. In the National Archives in Washington, D.C. is an application for an officer's commission under her married name Williams, and a pass written at the command of Major General Robert Schenck, Provost Marshal of Baltimore, dated November 15, 1863, appointing Miss Alice Williams as special agent in the Middle Department. So there's her whole story about working for the Union as a double agent, stemming from that direction. So clearly, while Women in Battle may be a highly embellished and fictionalized work, corroborating sources indicated she acted at times as a woman soldier and as a spy during the Civil War, as she claims in her book. Now, Velasquez is the only one to discuss her disguise. She writes that she had a specially tailored and padded officer's uniform made for her. She also had special underwear made for her, like this fine wire neck shield, which would give her a wider waist, it like buttoned to her pants to give her a more manly shape. And she also wore, as you can see from this lovely illustration, mustache and whiskers that were held on by glue. She wrote the times that she was discovered were times when she was careless in her disguise. Her disguise, or in her own words, her disguise was out of joint. Velasquez carefully observed and imitated male mannerisms with coaching of male friends. She learned to smoke, fly around with the boys, flirt with the ladies, and act the part of a deadly young man. And for one example of her disguise, she was imprisoned in Lynchburg under the suspicion of being a woman impersonating a soldier, which she was a lot. Velasquez says, she describes her actions, I stuck my feet on the windowsill and I turned my head and spit. This action attracted the attention of, there's two lady visitors in the area. The youngest of the two ladies who were entering, oh Mom, that can't be a woman, see how he spits. Letters written by a third woman soldier, Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, whose alias is Private Lyons Wakeman, she would enlist with the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry. These letters she wrote home to her family between 1862 and 1864, and they were kept by her family. And they were actually edited by Lauren Cook and published in 1996. They just had stayed in the attic until there was an issue at Antietam battlefield, actually, a woman, Lauren Cook, who was portraying a male soldier at Antietam battlefield, was asked to leave the battlefield by the Rangers there because women were not Civil War soldiers and she was misrepresenting history. Well, this ended up in a lawsuit, actually against the Department of the Interior. And in the course of the publication, the newspaper press reports on this, the family of Rosetta Wakeman like the black sheep in the family, and we've got the letters in the attic, would you like to look at them? And she really was a Civil War soldier. And so that Lauren Cook got to look at the letters, and she edited them and published them in 1996, so they're on the reading list. Sarah Rosetta Wakeman was born in Bainbridge, New York. And by the way, Lauren Cook did win the suit, so that's why, one of the reasons why we are able to be volunteers at Antietam and dressed as Civil War soldiers. Because she proved that we are not misrepresenting in our impressions. So,
How long ago was that?
1990, it was 1989. Yeah, the suit was 1990.
Not that long ago.
No. Well, Sarah Rosetta Wakeman was born in Bainbridge, New York in 1843. She was the eldest of 9 in a farming family. After finishing school in 1860, she worked as a female domestic. To help her father pay back debts that were owed on the family farm, in August of 1862, Wakeman sought better wages in an unconventional manner. She disguised herself as a man and took a job as a canal pole barge laborer, which paid $5 per trip. At the end of her first trip, she encountered soldiers recruiting young men to enlist with the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry. The $152 bounty, over a year's worth of her man's wages, and the $13 a month wage she would receive as a private soldier, made this venture very attractive. And indeed, on August 30th, 1862, she would enlist with the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry under the assumed name Lyons Wakeman. The regiment departed for Washington in October of 1862. Wakeman sent her enlistment bounty home and wrote that she would help pay back the debt her father owed for the farm. Now, Wakeman would be very happy with her Army life, especially the money and independence it gave her. In her words, "All the money I sent to you, I want you to spend for the family. Don't save it for me, for I can get all the money I want. If I ever return, I shall have money for myself and to divide with you." I can tell you what made me leave home. It was because I got tired of staying in that neighborhood. I knew I could help you more to leave home than to stay with you. So I left. I'm not sorry I left you. I believe it will be for the best yet. I believe that God will spare my life to come home once more. I will help you all as long as I live. I'm enjoying myself better this summer than I ever did before in this world. I have good clothing, enough to eat, nothing to do, only handle my gun. That I can do as well as the rest of them. I don't want you to mourn for me, for I can take care of myself. And I know my business as well as other folks know them for me. I will dress as I am mind to for all anyone else cares, and if they don't leave me alone, they should be sorry for it. I've enjoyed myself best since I've gone away from home than I ever did before in my life. I have plenty of money to spend and a good time soldier. Now, the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry was in Washington, D.C., and they were detailed to guard Old Capitol and Carroll prisons. At some point, they're doing this between July 1863 and February 1864. And at some point during this period, Wakeman wrote home that she guarded at Carroll Prison a woman who was a major in the Union Army, who went into battle with her men. She rode her horse and gave orders to the men. Now she is in prison for not doing according to the regulation of war, which, by being a woman, this is the question. It's like, what did she do according to the regulation of war? Was it some kind of court-martial offense, a dereliction of duty that she had done, or was it simply violating the regulations of war by being a woman employed as a soldier and officer in the U.S. military? That's not clear, and it's kind of ironic that this major is being guarded by a female soldier outside Carroll Prison. So in February of 1864, the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry was sent to Louisiana to join the Red River Campaign. And in April of 1864, the regiment would fight in the Battle of Sabine Crossroads and the Battle of Pleasant Hill, and would endure a 70-mile forced march retreat in 2 days. As a result of this campaign, Wakeman, like many of her male comrades, became sick with chronic diarrhea. She entered the regimental hospital on May 3rd, 1864, endured a 15-day OD Wakeman would die from acute diarrhea on June 19, 1864. She is buried as Life Wakeman and rests today at Chalmette National Cemetery in Chalmette, Louisiana.
And her real name was?
Rosetta.
Rosetta.
Rosetta Wakeman. Two letters survive that document the service of the fourth woman soldier, Mary Ann Clark, whose alias was Henry Clark. They are in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society. One of the letters was written by Clark's mother and describes how Clark left home after Clark's husband abandoned her and married another woman. Mary Ann Clark spoke to her mother about joining the Army, but her mother didn't believe that she would actually do it. Nevertheless, Mary Ann left one night in October of 1861, and the first news her mother heard of her was that she had joined Confederate General Braxton Bragg's army and had united with the cavalry company under the assumed name of Henry Clark. Mary Ann Clark's own letter that she wrote was dated to December 1862, reveals her sacrifice and sadness at leaving her children, Caroline and Gideon, and her conviction to continue the fight despite a great personal cost. It reads, "I wish you would write to Miss E.A.W. Burbage for me," she's writing to a friend, and E.A.W. Burbage is her mother, "and tell her all you know about me, how, where, and when I was taken prisoner, and tell her what a good rebel soldier I have been. Tell her about me getting wounded and my detection. Tell her that Caroline Elizabeth and Gideon P. Walker are in the care of Reverend Father Brady in Louisville. Tell her that I never expect to see her again, as I may be killed in battle. There is a battle impending at Vicksburg, and I expect to be in it. Our officers here tell me they will exchange me for a man. If you will be so kind as to do this for me, I will be 1,000 times obliged to you. I would write to her myself, but I cannot. I get so filled with tears whenever I attempt it that I cannot write. You will find her one of the most uncompromising rebels in Kentucky. I expect to start for Vicksburg in the morning. With my love to all my friends in Louisville, Mary Ann Clark." Her signature. Based on the research of Landon and Cook, Mary Ann Clark was wounded in the thigh at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, which was fought at the end of August of 1862. She was discovered to be a woman, but nevertheless was taken prisoner, kept as a prisoner of war. She was held at several prisons, the last being in Cairo, Illinois, and was exchanged in December of 1862. After her exchange, newspaper stories about her were published, and she was recognized by soldiers like Robert Hodges of the 24th Texas Cavalry, who wrote to his father in a letter that he had seen, quote, "the heroic Mary Ann Clark wearing lieutenant's bars at Turner Station, Tennessee," so that they start becoming recognizable military figures in their own right, and are obviously known to be women, and they're staying in the service, and they're gaining rank. So most women soldiers do not have published accounts or letters. Perhaps we will find others in attics in the future, but at this point, most women soldiers that we know of were discovered when death, accident, sickness, or wounding forced the revelation of their true gender. These surprising discoveries are reported in military records and the personal writings of military or hospital officials.
Women soldiers were discovered among the dead on the battlefield. In the official record of the War of the Rebellion, General William Hayes reports his regiment was detailed to bury the dead on the field. He reports that the following number of dead were buried at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania by my command from July 2nd to the 5th inclusive. He lists numbers and locations of bodies. And under the remarks he put, "one female private in rebel uniform." The body of the woman had been found at the angle, and she had been killed in Pickett's charge. Women soldiers were also sometimes arrested after they were found out. Alonzo Pratt was the provost at Harper's Ferry, and he writes a letter to the provost in Baltimore. Quote, "I have the honor to forward to you under guard 2 female prisoners, bogus soldiers, entitled Kate alias James Johnson and Eliza Francis alias Frank Glenn. They were arrested for loitering about the camps dressed in the U.S. uniform and claiming to belong to Company K, 1st West Virginia Cavalry. gobbled as speedily as possible by the military authorities. I would respectfully recommend that you make a levy on some of the generous feminines of Baltimore for a proper suite of wearing apparel for the benefit of these wayward damsels. It seems that Harper's Ferry was a real hotbed for women soldiers. Provost Clerk Charles Moulton writes in his memoirs an account, actually several accounts. He corroborates Alonzo Pratt's story of the 2 female prisoners in his journal. He also mentions at least 12 other women soldiers being brought into the Provost Marshal's office in the course of just 2 months. He writes, among the rebel prisoners lately brought in was a female Reb. She's about 17 years of age with a delicate voice, but not very good looking. Her name is Sarah Mitchell, alias Charlie West, and she belongs to the 18th Virginia Cavalry. When she was captured, her voice belied her, and she was soon found out. She's a spunky little specimen of the feminine gender, true brave, and succeeded in making her escape from the guardhouse the night before last. She was, however, retaken last night and brought in again this morning. She boasted she would get away again, but I think she'll be disappointed in her expectations. She's to be taken to Washington tomorrow. In another account, Moulton writes, we have just received 2 more female soldiers belonging to the 1st Virginia Cavalry Union Regiment. They had been with the regiment about 10 months and making very good-looking boys. They had passed as such until, alas, the recruiting surgeon came around for examinations. They were tanned and sunburned all right, but their voice betrayed them in the mind of the surgeon. Not many would have denied but that they were really boys, they were so perfectly initiated. But at any rate, murder will out. They are to be taken to Baltimore tomorrow, and I happen to be the lucky chap to conduct them there. Mary Ann McKenzie, alias Henry Fitzallen, was arrested and detained in Charleston, West Virginia, for impersonating a man and under suspicion of being a spy. Her written statement can be found in the National Archives. She writes that she was arrested by a patrol guard in Charleston on December 20th, and she came in with the 1st Illinois Cavalry. She says, I've been in the U.S. service for 6 months. It was the 23rd Kentucky Regimental Infantry that I belonged to. I enlisted on 4th October 1861. I was in the service 4 months before my sex was known, and after that was found out, they put me in the hospital, and I remained there as a nurse for 2 months. I never saw any of the Confederate Army until arrested and confined in the guardhouse. I came into the Valley with the Union Army when they took possession of the Valley last fall. I never gave any information to the rebels, nor arrested them in any way. I have been dressed in men's clothes about 1.5 years. Women soldiers were also sometimes found out by accident. No less than General Philip Sheridan writes of an incident in his memoirs about 2 women who were serving as soldiers under his command. Ella Reno, a teamster, and Sarah Bradbury, a private. The general writes, while out on a foraging expedition, these Amazons had secured a supply of applejack by some means, got very drunk, and on the return had fallen into Stones River and been nearly drowned. After they had been fished from the water, in the process of resuscitation, their sex was disclosed. Though up to this time, they appeared to be known only to each other. Ella Reno and Sarah Bradbury were actually interviewed by General Sheridan before being dismissed from the Army.
Women soldiers were discovered by surgeons and nurses. One of the most famous of humanitarians, Clara Barton, was asked by Assistant Surgeon F.H. Harwood of the 5th Wisconsin Infantry after the Battle of Antietam to help him examine a wounded soldier who refused examination. The doctor suspected that this young man was actually a young woman and asked Clara Barton to calm the soldier so she could be treated. The soldier confessed to Clara Barton that indeed she was a woman from Frederick, Maryland, named Mary Galloway, who had disguised herself as a soldier to follow a young lieutenant in the 3rd Wisconsin. Assistant Surgeon Harwood was astonished not only to find a female in soldier's clothes, but also that the bullet passed through her chest without injuring any internal organs, and that she fared so well after 36 hours without food or water on the battlefield before she was found and treated. According to Harwood, Clara Barton assisted Mary in locating her beloved, who was also wounded at Antietam, and reunited them in the Washington Hospital. And also goes on to describe the couple would later marry, and they would evidently name their first daughter
after they gave birth. General Rosecrans, commanding general of the Army of the Cumberland, complains in a telegram to General Alexander McCook. And this telegram is in the National Archives, and you can request to see it. It's pretty fun. Murfreesboro, April 17, 1863. The general commanding directs me to call your attention to a flagrant outrage committed in your command. The medical director reports that an orderly sergeant in Brigadier General Johnson's division was today delivered of a baby, which is violation of all military law and Army regulations. No such case has been known since the days of Jupiter. You will apply a proper punishment in the case and a remedy to prevent a repetition of the act.
In a separate incident occurring in the Army of the Potomac, Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Root of the 21st New York Infantry, soon to be Colonel of the 94th New York Infantry, in Camp Iroquois Creek, Virginia, wrote the following to his mother in a letter dated October of 1863. When I was last on duty as General Officer of the Day, I came across a very singular case of illness out on the picket line. A corporal of a New Jersey regiment who was on duty with the pickets complained of being unwell. But little notice was given of his complaints at first. His pain and other symptoms of severe indisposition increased, becoming so evident that his officers had him carried to a nearby farmhouse. There the worthy corporal was safely delivered of a fine fat little recruit for the regiment. on picket duty and then going into labor. It's pretty amazing to me. Women soldiers continued to be discovered after the war. At the beginning of this talk, I briefly introduced you to Elder Cashier, or Jenny Hodgers, as her female name was known. She was only discovered after a 1911 automobile accident. She had enlisted with the 95th Illinois Infantry in August of 1862. She was with her regiment at the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. She was in the Red River Campaign of 1864. She fought in the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864 and would muster out with the regiment on August 17, 1865. After the war, she continued living as a man, was employed as a farm laborer and handyman until the automobile accident of 1911. Her secret was kept by surgeons and friends until 1913 when the story leaked to the press. And the story caused an investigation for pension fraud, because here was this woman who had been receiving a pension, and the government had to make sure that this pension was a deserved pension. How in the world did they have a woman that was enlisted in the Army in the first place? So, and that haunted her. At the same time, she was deemed to be an insane woman and committed to Watertown State Hospital. Forced to live in a woman's ward and wear a dress. Remind you, she hadn't worn a dress in, since, she says since she was a little kid, like since she was like 5 years old. So, she tripped, she fell, she broke her hip. She would be bedridden for the rest of her life. Nevertheless, her comrades in arms rallied to support her, because now they had this whole pension investigation. And they would visit her in state care, and they testified to the pension that she was unmistakably the same brave little soldier of Company G, and to have that pension fraud taken care of. It was not fraudulent. This was a real Civil War veteran. She had served. She was deserving of the pension, and they would prove that. She was exonerated in December of 1914 of pension fraud, but she would die because of that injury in 1915. But she was buried in her uniform and received full military honors. At least at the end of her life, they recognized her service. Now there are other post-war discoveries. In 1934, 9 human skeletons with pieces of uniform cloth, Union buttons, and benet balls were discovered in a mass grave on private property adjacent to Shiloh National Military Park. The excavation was supervised by Shiloh's superintendent and by an archaeologist from the Smithsonian Institution who happened to be at the site who was excavating Native American burials. And when they found this other grave, and he was called in to help with that. And actually, it was believed that this archaeologist was probably the one that identified one of the skeletal remains as being the woman because of the pelvic structure of the skeleton. And the proximity of the navel to the body suggests that she was shot and then buried on the field in a mass grave from Shiloh. So current archival and database research is ongoing to identify and verify the service of women soldiers in the Civil War. The premise is a challenging one, as these women do not want to be identified as women. They disguise themselves as men, they